Well, my watch says 5 after, so let's get started. I think that most of you know that I'm Ron Wright, one of the faculty member here in psychiatry, and I'm introducing our speaker today, who is a professor from the other side of campus, family studies, which I don't know if you know that we have not only a psychology department, a communication department, but a family studies department. So there are actually 3 departments and probably more on main campus that do things that are really quite related to some of the things that we do in psychiatry, or at least things that we ought to do in psychiatry, or that influence what we do in psychiatry. And certainly relationships have a great deal to do with what we deal with in psychiatry. And relationships have a great deal to do with even individual kinds of behaviors like smoking and drinking and eating. So the talk that we're going to hear today is about someone who studies relationships with the idea of understanding behavior, understanding food behavior in particular. She is the director of the Health, Emotions, and Relationships. Got all those together? Health, emotion, relationships. Okay, so how do we feel? How do we interact with other people? And mental health and physical health, right? Both pieces. So this, I think, is a really neat thing. It's a social psychologist. This to me is, the kernel of so many of the things that we do, and yet psychiatrists really don't hear as much about relationships as I think it would be useful to do so. She has a undergraduate degree from Simon Fraser University and a PhD from Stanford in psychology. Dissertation topic is interpersonal emotion regulation, which sort of should sound like what she's telling us about today, so she apparently knows something about this. Has nothing to disclose, no relationships with pharmaceutical manufacturers or Oreo cookie manufacturers. Is that true?
True, very true.
And her title today is Love, Anger, and Food, Emotional and Relationship Factors Influencing Eating.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm told that that is going to show up there so that you guys are going to see what I'm seeing. Is that true? We'll see what happens. I don't want to add too much to that. As he mentioned, I'm in the Family Studies program here at the University of Arizona. I also did do a postdoc here in the psychology department. So I've been hanging around campus for a little longer than it might appear. Before I dive in, too, I'll do a quick plug for the HER research group, which he just mentioned, which is the Health, Emotions, and Relationships group. The whole thing's hard to remember, but if you just remember it's HER research, then it's easy to keep in mind. And we do a regular talk series. We've done a mini conference in the past, a lot of collaborative stuff. And so if any of you have any interest in that, I'll have my email up at the end. Just email me. We have a listserv. I can add you to that. And I'd like to also say thank you to the Francis McCullen Institute for Children, Youth, and Families, who's been very supportive of this research. And that's an interdisciplinary research group associated with our school, the Norton School. And so I'd like to say thank you to them for the support. And with that, I'll dive in. Yeah, you can sort of see it. You can sort of see it. I can see it back there, so we can all see it. Oh, and you have a handout as well. There you go. We're well covered here. So I think as a broad overview, something you all are very, very aware of is that obesity has become a major problem, not only in North America, but across the industrialized world. And it's directly contributing to numerous physical illnesses. And at this point, like 65% of the American adult population is overweight or obese, and that number is going up. So this is one of our most serious health problems that have the behavioral component at this point. So we can say, well, what causes obesity? Obviously, we would like to know. Well, the very simple answer is if you eat too much and don't do enough, or have some kind of genetic predisposition to have low metabolism, you're going to have a problem with weight gain. So the very simple answer is obesity is caused by too many calories in versus not enough calories out. Okay, but that's a pretty simplistic answer. So why are some people prone to this, others aren't? Why has it changed over 30 years? What's going on here? No, do not restart. Quit asking me that. So obviously the actual answer to how we ended up with this social problem, this health problem, is much more complex than just calories in, calories out. Why has this imbalance occurred for so many people? Well, one thing that's really clear is that the contemporary social environment is completely toxic when it comes to healthy weight control. So we have advertising, we have fast food places, it's cheaper to eat unhealthy food. It's pushed on us through advertising, and again, you can see here, that's across the industrialized world, not just here. Children are exposed to marketing, so the environment doesn't help, absolutely. And genetics clearly play a role. There's a growing body of research really showing how important the genetic factors are. But that's still not really the whole answer. Not everyone gains weight. We're all exposed to this poisonous environment. Genetics haven't really changed in 30 years, and yet so some people end up in this unhealthy eating and obesity, with problems with obesity or overweight, and others do not. And so I think where we really need to, or how we need to think about it is with a biopsychosocial framework, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with the very simple idea that yes, the environment and genetics matter, but they play through many different factors. Well, what are those? We can think about biological processes. So genetics are expressed in biological forms. We can think about psychological processes. So that's the psycho in the biopsychosocial. We can think about social processes, the relationships that we're in, and the larger social network. And so this is the approach that I've taken to my research. I think, so at first I just want to say the environment is critical, genetics are critical, but those aren't the parts that I'm trying to tackle. I'm trying to tackle all these other layers that modulate those processes. So this is just another picture of the same thing to give you another flavor for it. So you can think of this biopsychosocial model as this radiating, typically it's often drawn as circles, but it was easier to draw squares, so I went with squares. But at the core, we have this sort of genetic component that gets expressed in our individual biology. My focus particularly then is on autonomic physiology, our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And I'll talk a bit later about why that focus. There's other biological processes you could look at for sure. This just happens to be my target. Then at the psychological level, I'm interested in emotion and emotion regulation. And again, you could pick a whole bunch of different psychological processes that would be important. This just happens to be my area of expertise, and I'll talk about why I think it matters. And then at the social level, I really am focused on close relationships, family relationships. Again, you could look broader. There's a really interesting work now on social networks, watching or looking at how people interact with people even in other cities and so on, over internet and so on, and that becomes a factor. But I'm really sticking with the close relationships part. So I'll say I'm going to work backward again now and say a little bit more about my focus. So in the domain of close relationships, I've really focused on married or cohabiting couples. Eventually, we definitely need to understand these processes in the extended family, so with children involved. But first, my training is in adult relationships, so that's where I have something more to say. And also, most American adults, well, adults throughout the world, will spend much of their life in a committed, married, or married-like relationship. So it's one of our most predominant close social networks that we spend much of our life in. And then the married couple is also responsible for setting in motion the habits and beliefs around eating and food and exercise for their children. So we need to, I think, understand the kind of processes within the couple that set up these bad habits and dysfunctional beliefs that then get passed on to the children. So again, I think how that happens, how it gets to the children is going to be really important, but we need to understand even just the dyadic level first. And so yeah, basically we know that the children of obese parents are at risk of becoming obese as well. Some of that's genetics, but it doesn't explain all of it. And so I think we need to understand these couple level processes that set this in motion before we can even understand how this intergenerational transmission happens. So I'll be talking about married and cohabiting couples. In the realm of emotion and emotion regulation, there is a long history linking emotions to eating. The psychosomatic model was proposed in the 50s of how some people respond to stress by eating and using it as self-medication, and that they then gain weight, especially under stressful circumstances. So that idea has been with us for 70 years. A recent paper by Macht looked at this large literature over 50 years, 60 years, and tried to summarize the various pathways by which emotion seems to influence eating. And he came up with a 5-factor model. I would add a 6th. And you can't really tell the colors here. I tried to color the ones that I'll be focusing on a little different, but the first one that he emphasizes is that the food directly induces emotions. So if you see gross food, you get disgusted. If you see palatable food, we tend to have a pleasure reaction. And that this then guides our food choices. So that's how advertising works partly. It shows you a very pleasurable image of food, induces some mild positive emotion, which tends to make you want to go eat that food. So I'm not going to focus on that, but that's one route. Another route is that intense emotion actually seems to suppress appetite in most people. And so one of the confusing things in the literature has been, does stress make people eat or eat less? Well, what it seems to really matter is how stressed. Mild stress, people tend to eat more, but intense stress, like serious life events, people eat less typically. So again, that won't be my focus, but that's another thread. One of the ones I will focus on is the fact that they've shown that emotion can actually impair people's attempts to control their eating. So many of you have probably heard of cognitive restraint or dietary restraint of food intake. And so people who are dieting tend to have this, they're restraining their intake. And what's been found in the lab over and over is anything that stresses or distracts or overloads that control, that restraint, leads those people to overeat. And negative emotions, and it turns out positive emotions too. In lab paradigms, they've shown that if someone is dieting and you bring them in the lab, you induce any emotion at all, they tend to eat more. And this is not true for people who are not restraining themselves. So it seems to have something to do with the sort of overload on that restraint system. So that will be important for one thing, for a study I'll be telling you about. There's also a fair bit of evidence that overweight and normal weight people too do tend to eat in response to negative emotions to self-soothe. Almost anyone you ask, if you say, if you're really upset, are you going to eat more? Oh yeah, it makes me feel a little better. You know, I was so upset yesterday I couldn't resist the chocolate bar. And this does seem to be true in the literature when big studies, and it looks like maybe more true for heavier people, but everyone does it a certain amount. A 5th route that emotions are linked to food is that let's see how to say this one. Basically, the first thing I said is if food induces a positive emotion, you're more likely to want to eat it. The reverse is true too. If you're in a positive mood and you're presented with food, you're more likely to see it as palatable and want to eat it. So there seems to be this sort of circular route there, and that won't be so important. Now, a factor that Mac did not take into account that I think would be an important 6th factor is that the relationship role that food plays, whether it's something you do together, whether it's something associated with security, that could also then elicit emotion, which could then modulate that eating. So I'll talk about that in the second study. Just a word of overview, too. Where I'm going with this, I've got 2 studies I'll tell you about. If we run out of time, no big deal. So I'll tell you about at least 1 and maybe 2. And they'll address some of these different factors. Finally, and here we're moving through that biopsychosocial model. Well, I guess we're going in now. We went from married cohabiting couples to emotion and emotion regulation, down to the physiological level. And as I mentioned, my focus really is on autonomic physiology. So our autonomic branch, you probably all know, involves the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Often they work counter to each other, but not always. And both, over a huge literature, have been linked with emotion, with stress, with self-regulation, with quality of social interactions, and with eating, and directly with obesity. And these are 2 separate literatures. There's one large literature, sort of social psychophysiology, that looks at autonomic responses with emotions and self-regulation and social stuff. There's another literature, medical literature, looking at obesity and eating linked to sympathetic and parasympathetic control. And those 2 literatures have not talked to each other so far as I can tell. So one of the things I'm interested in is trying to bring those 2 together. Oh, stop it. Okay, so as promised, 2 studies. This study we are just about to submit for publication, well, for review, I suppose, publication in the end. We're calling it Suppressing to Please and Eating to Cope. And it's about the effects of overweight women's emotion suppression and on romantic relationships and on eating. And this is work that I'm doing along with Ashley Randall, who's here, and another graduate student, Valerie Young. So this study is going to focus on two of those main emotional factors: dietary restraint, emotion breaking down dietary restraint, and emotion sort of as emotion, eating as emotion regulation or self-soothing. And we're going to also look at the role of relationships in this. So there's a fairly good, well, there is a literature suggesting evidence that overweight women, and especially overweight women with bulimic symptoms, tend to report poorer emotion regulation in various ways. So they tend to report more avoidant coping, which is known not to be that effective. If you avoid the problem, you can't fix it. They tend to report fewer emotion regulation strategies, so they have less things they do to try to fix their emotions or improve their emotions. And they have lower regulation self-efficacy, so they have less confidence that if they were in a bad mood, that they could in fact help themselves get out of it. In addition, one study of overweight women, there's one interesting qualitative study where they did interviews with overweight women, women who saw themselves as overweight, and what they found is that these women reported trying to suppress their negative emotions in their relationship in order to really please their partner, in order to avoid conflict, in order to keep their male partners happy. And they approached this from exchange theory of relationships, arguing that heavier women are stigmatized within our society. They may feel sort of disadvantaged and in a weaker position in the relationships, and feel more that they really need to cater to their partners and in order to keep those partners. So, putting this together, some of my prior research was on emotion suppression, and so this definitely suggests that these women may be using this somewhat ineffective form of emotion regulation. Suppression it tends to not make you feel any better. It just hides how you're feeling. And that they may be doing this in their relationships, though, in order to really try to preserve those relationships. Well, what effect might that have? Ironically, most of the literature suggests, as I just said, when you suppress your emotions, you don't feel any better. If anything, you feel worse. And it, for the most part, seems to actually have not very good social effects. It breaks down intimacy, it gets in the way of problem solving. But there are also some literature suggesting that if you're someone who's generally angry or feeling a lot of strong negative emotions on a regular basis, in that situation, suppressing some of that may actually be helpful, especially to a long-term relationship partner. So to the extent that overweight women are stigmatized, maybe feeling less secure about themselves, tend to have lower self-esteem, may have more problems with anxiety and depression, in their case, suppressing their emotions may in fact have this positive effect on their partners. Well, we don't know. The study that I told you about, they didn't interview the partners. We know the women were trying to make them happy. We have no idea if that's what happened. So I think that was one real interesting question then that we set out to answer. If they do suppress their emotions, is it actually achieving what they want, or is it going to backfire? Okay, and if they're suppressing their emotions, what effects would this have on eating? Here, the answer is very, very clear. It shouldn't do anything good. So there's Stice's two-pathway model to overeating. He argues that negative emotions can end up increasing your eating for two reasons. One, we talked about eating as emotion regulation. So if you're feeling a lot of negative emotion and then you use it to self-soothe, you're going to be eating more, increased food intake. Two, if you're feeling these negative emotions and you're meanwhile trying to diet, again, there's a bunch of lab work saying that, that the negative emotion is going to break down that dietary restraint, you're going to end up eating more. And suppression would just exacerbate both of these effects. If you're feeling negative emotion and you suppress it, we know you're not going to feel any better. So you're fairly likely, if you're going to eat to self-soothe, you're going to have to eat to self-soothe because the suppression won't have helped. Or if you're trying to diet and you're feeling these negative emotions and you try to suppress them, that's even more cognitive load. There's a lot of research showing that suppression actually is a cognitive load that makes people basically they can't pay attention to things, they forget things. So it certainly should contribute to this diet breakdown and dietary restraint. So we have this picture where these overweight women may be suppressing more because of relationship reasons. And at the same time, this should absolutely be setting them up for emotional eating and breakdown in dietary restraint. So here I'm just saying it. In this case, for these women, emotion suppression may basically put them in a double bind. If they're right, that their partners would like them to keep it to themselves, then they may get this actual relationship benefit. But at the same time, it should put them at risk of increased eating and potential further weight gain. So, to address these questions, we got a community sample of committed heterosexual couples, and I'll say more about the details in a minute, and used a daily diary methodology. So these are people reporting every day for a week on their emotions, their relationship quality, and their eating. And we got reports from both partners, since, as I said, the one qualitative study suggested these women were trying to have good effects on their relationship. We didn't know if they were. So we wanted to find out from their partners if that's in fact happening. So just to put it in very concrete terms, then we went in with 3 hypotheses. One, we're going to use BMI, body mass index, as basically weight status. And we would argue that women with higher body mass index then should report suppressing more on average than women with lower BMI, based on the various literatures that I mentioned. However then, on days when women with higher BMI suppress, we would expect their partners to report more positive and less negative feelings about them, if they're actually having that effect. But for lower BMI women, we would suggest either that's not going to be present, or it may even be the opposite, which is what we tend to find in the larger literature on suppression. Then finally, we predicted that the women with higher BMI, on those days when they reported suppressing more, would also report eating more than average, due to, again, this eating as emotion regulation and or breakdown of restraint. But again, this shouldn't be present for women with lower BMI, who should be less prone to emotional eating and are less prone to dieting. So this is one of my colleague, Melissa Curran, is a faculty member in our department. And this is one of her best ideas ever. We managed to recruit these people by giving course credit to undergraduates in order to recruit a couple into the study. So if an undergrad in our classes got a committed heterosexual couple to take part, the student got extra credit, and the couple was entered into a lottery that they could win some money. So, brilliant idea. Lots of data, quick. It really worked out well. We required that both partners participated. They had to be over 18. They had to have been in a committed relationship. I think we had 3 months. The students could participate themselves if they had a committed partner who was also willing to participate. And as I said, then participants actually were in a lottery then. This resulted in a really big initial sample. We had 241 people complete at least a baseline survey. We then had to clean that up. So the price of this quick and dirty data collection is you end up with kind of dirty initial data, and you need to clean it up. But that's possible. So we removed 33 individuals because their partner did not, in fact, get on there and do anything. So that left us with 104 couples. We removed three couples because the wife did these days and the husband did these days. Thanks, they didn't quite get the point. We've improved our instructions for future studies. We had 4 couples that were removed because one or both of them only did the baseline. They didn't do the diary days. And then there were 6 couples that we removed because every single day for 7 days, the 2 people entered their data within a few minutes of each other, which suggests to me that that was one person. So it's possible they were sitting there back to back, but we didn't really trust those, so we removed them as well. So we're pretty confident that our remaining sample of 91 couples who had done at least 1 day of data each really are 2 people, really are in a committed relationship, and yeah, basically. One other interesting thing with this data collection is we ended up with the most perfect bimodal distribution of age I've ever seen, because the people are either undergraduates and their partners, or their parents, or their older siblings and partners, which it makes for a very nice wide age range in this sample. So I think the average was 33.7, but that ranged from like 19 to 69 years old. And so it gives a nice broad view across the age range. Along with that, of course, then we have a fairly big variation in relationship length. Again, the mean is almost meaningless at 9 years. It went from 3 months, which was our minimum, up to 42 years. So, and I think we got a fair bit of diversity this way in the kinds of couples that we're looking at. It really does end up being a community sample with a lot of variance. About 70% were living together, about 43% were married, and about 40% had children. So again, we've kind of got a fairly good range of committed couples. This is, however, very much a European American sample, 73% Caucasian. So what they did very quickly is just a baseline survey. So the first day they signed on, it was just a set of questions they answered once. And the important ones for that there were self-reported height and weight. Now, self-reported height and weight aren't great. It would be much better to get them in the lab. We know that the women are going to underreport their weight and the men are going to overreport their height. And so everybody's BMI is going to be lower than it should be. At the same time, however, that just makes our tests of our hypotheses more conservative. It means it's squishing the range for us. So it works against us, not for us. Then on a daily basis for 7 days, they did individual items on, first of all, positive and negative emotions due to their partner. So this is to try to get at this. How are they feeling about their partner on that day? And so the wording was, to what extent did you experience either positive or negative feelings, such as joy or relaxation, anger or sadness, due to your partner? Then they did a one-item emotion suppression, which was I kept my feelings to myself. And then to get at eating, it's notoriously difficult to get people to tell you what they actually ate. It's way harder than to even get what they weigh. And so to try to stay away from this issue of absolute amounts, we devised a question that really asks about variability relative to themselves. So we said, since the last time you did these questions, did you eat about the same as usual, less than usual, or more than usual? And the idea here is people aren't even very good at telling you how many calories they took in or how healthy it was. But they're not too bad over a 1-week period of figuring out if it was a little more than yesterday or a little less and so on. And it's really even those fluctuations around our own mean that can get us into trouble. So this is really about in-person variability. For any of the stats people in the crowd, one interesting thing with this kind of data is you've got several levels of nesting. You've got individuals doing stuff multiple times over a week, which creates autocorrelation. And then you also have people in couples, and 2 people in a couple should be more similar than they are to each other than to everybody else. And so couples can be correlated. So to deal with this, I used a 2-intercept model for dyadic diary data. If anyone's interested, feel free to pick my brain, or if you have data that you want to analyze, feel free to talk to me. And we combined this with Kenny's actor-partner model, which is really, you predict one person's outcome from both people's predictor. So I've been predicting, say, my relationship feelings from both my own body mass index and my partner's body mass index, etc. Well, what did we find? Our first one is a blank slide. We had predicted that women with higher BMI would report suppressing more over the week. Nope. The average over the week was about the same regardless of body mass index. I think one possibility for this is there's a fair bit, like I say in the previous literature, suggesting we should find these between people differences. But this is the only study I know of that's looked at it daily. And one advantage of daily is you get rid of this kind of retrospective bias. So people are probably much better at telling you how much they suppressed on a given day than trying to compare themselves sort of to other people on average in some global sense. So you never really know what a null finding is telling you, but more importantly though, our second and third hypotheses were supported. So it's going to be a little, oh no, that's right, you've got the big screen now. Oh, but I'm not allowed to get near it. Okay, I'll be good. So this is the prediction that when women with higher BMI suppress, they would in fact have these positive effects on their partners, that their male partners would feel better about them. And this would not be true for lighter women. So what we have on the x-axis is the woman's suppression relative to herself day to day. So low scores are like I was below my normal suppression. High scores are I'm above my normal suppression. On the y-axis, we have my male partner's negative feelings about me. So this is how much he said, I felt anger and sadness due to me. And let's focus first on the solid black line. That's low normal, women with a low normal BMI. So that would be a BMI of equal 19. And what we see is, yes, for these low weight women, on days when they suppress more than their normal, their husband feels more negative about them. And this is probably our normal finding of it's breaking down intimacy, it's breaking down communication, they're probably having a fight and not talking to each other. So that's what we typically do find with increased suppression. In contrast, let's take the other extreme, the dotted line, which was a woman with a BMI that we would put her in an obese category by national norms. So it would be a BMI of 33. We have a significant slope in the opposite direction. So if I'm an obese woman and I report suppressing more than normal, on that day my husband reports fewer negative feelings about me, suggesting that these overweight women in that qualitative study might have been right, that they may be suppressing things like anger and constant negativity, that their husbands actually do appreciate it when they aren't expressing it. And I think that's kind of a very sad double bind that society's creating here for these women. The two slopes in the middle, normal BMI at 22.5 or overweight, actually this holds for the overweight BMI of 27.5. So that's also a negative slope. In the normal, there's no effect. So for woman at 22.5, suppressing isn't predicting her husband's feelings one way or the other. So this suggests, yes, indeed, there is a difference for women of different weight categories in what happens socially and relationally when they keep their emotions to themselves. How about eating? Well, we see a very similar pattern. This is the same thing on the x-axis, how much they suppress relative to themselves. And this now is how much they reported eating that day, with 1 would be less than normal, 2 is about normal, 3 would be above more than normal. So this is definitely a small effect, but it is significant. What we see is everybody thinks they always eat the same as normal, more or less, which is good. That's what they should be saying. And again, if we look at the dotted line, which would be a woman with a BMI categorizing her as obese at 33, on days where she suppresses more, you do in fact see that she reports eating slightly more than normal, and certainly more than on other days. For the low, let's see, now the slopes are significant for women at the obese and overweight BMIs. So the two steepest lines up are significantly increases, and then the other two, normal BMI and low normal, there's no effect. So, in summary then, although these overweight women did not suppress their emotions more on average, which as I mentioned could have something to do with reporting biases, on the days when they did suppress, their partners felt less negative about them, and the women reported eating more than they had on the other days. So suppression may really be a dangerous kind of emotion regulation for these women. Now, obviously, this was in many ways an exploratory study. I don't know of any work like it, so we had to start somewhere. But that, of course, leaves us with many limitations. We really don't know the mechanisms. We're not sure why those husbands are reporting less negativity. We're not sure the role that emotions are playing in this. But it certainly does show the importance of these self-regulatory factors and how they can have one kind of social benefit while at the same time having a health detriment. So we'll definitely be doing more work with this. You can pause for a second. Any questions or anything about that before I move on to a slightly different line of thought?
I'm surprised you would describe that as a social benefit, that a partner would appreciate the fact that somebody was not expressing themselves.
Yeah, social benefit in the sense of you're getting a positive response from your partner. They're saying, "How now? You've been really nice today." You know, "I'm feeling good about you." So it's a benefit in that sense, but I absolutely agree. It's a huge cost potentially over the long run, and a social cost in that sense. And I think that's one of the really important things that we need to look at further. And that's actually part of what the second study I'll tell you about is what are the dynamics in these different relationships depending on the weight status of both people. So that's actually a great lead-in. Anything else? I'm happy to take things at the end. But that's actually a pretty good lead-in to my next. This now then is a teaser. This is a study we've been trying to get done for about a year, and we're finally really up to speed now that we have a nice new lab in our new building. And so Ashley here has been spending weekends collecting data. and we're well on our way. So I'm only going to have very tentative results from this one. But I think it addresses some of the issues that were just raised. So this one we've been broadly calling love, anger, and food, marital processes that promote obesity. And I've had several collaborators in developing this work. David Sabara, who I think spoke here last week, Cynthia Thompson in the nutrition department, Julie Ewing at the VA, and then numerous students like Ashley and Shannon who've been slaving day in and day out to actually do all the work. So this study takes a slightly different take. I began this by looking back at what research I could find on marriage and weight, anything to do with marriage and weight or eating. And what I found, there is some, and it's completely contradictory. You can find any result you want. So one line of research, people have looked at what happens to people's weight when they either start cohabiting or when they get married or when they get divorced. And what they found, sometimes they find that both partners gain weight after starting to cohabit. So that's been found. They've also found that women, but not men, gain weight. And then in another one, they found that men, but not women, gained weight. And they've got very good sociological reasons why all of this might be true. Another angle has been to look at weight loss from surgery, so radical weight loss, and what does that do to the relationship? Again, there's one body of work saying it's great for the relationship and everybody's happier. There's another body of work saying it causes conflict and relationship breakup and because of this radical change in the relationship. Okay. Well, how about weight loss and weight maintenance programs? There was a lot of enthusiasm, what are the dates here, sort of the 80s. A lot of enthusiasm for, hey, okay, the reason we can get people to lose weight but they always gain it back is we're not taking into account their social networks. So we need to get the partners into the weight loss programs. Sounds good. And completely contradictory results. A fair number of programs did find that, yes, indeed, people lost weight better and kept it off better if their partner was involved. But an equally large number of well-thought-out studies found no effect whatsoever. And at least one study found that men lost more weight if their wife wasn't having anything to do with it. Throughout all three of these literatures, the discussion section always says, the reason for these discrepancies is probably something about what's going on inside these relationships. There's probably different dynamics, different relationship patterns, different power structures. That's probably what it is. I don't know of a single study that's addressed that hypothesis. So I agree, that probably is what's going on. But there's absolutely no basic research on the topic. So that's where we come in. And I think so you have to start somewhere. I think one really important relationship factor could be the joint weight status of the couple. Are you both overweight and trying to deal with this? Is only one person overweight? Or are you both normal weight? And the kind of issues around weight loss, weight gain, I think are going to be very different, depending whether this is a dyadic affair, so to speak, or an individual within a dyad. And I don't think it's so much the weight that matters as the dynamics that it sets in place. So here's a simple diagram of what we're trying to look at. And as you see, you get a circular pattern. So we're starting with weight status, whether both people are overweight or only one is, as a proxy or as setting in motion different kinds of relationship dynamics. And I'm going to talk about two in particular that may be very different for different weight couples. And those relationship dynamics should set in motion different kinds of emotional responding and emotion regulation issues that eating and activity will feed into. So the basic argument is, depending on these relationship dynamics around eating and activity, you're going to have very different emotional factors associated with eating and activity, which is all going to contribute to behaviors of eating and activity, which are going to feed back into your weight status. And we continue. So I promised two dynamics. I think there's two particular relationship dynamics that have been discussed in the literature that could be very relevant. One is what's been called symptom system fit. And if you can say that quickly, I'll give you something. SSF. And what this is really when some problematic behavior, like smoking or drinking, alcohol drinking, actually fits a relational system by contributing to it and contributing to positive relationship processes. So I'll give you an example from the smoking literature. In some work that I did with Varda Schoem and Michael Rohrbaugh, we found that when both partners smoked together, they both felt more positive emotions. So it looked like this kind of bonding process. Where only one partner smoked, when they started smoking, both people felt less positive. So it's not just simply nicotine causing positive emotion, it's something about that relational system. And the argument would be smoking in this case is fitting the relational system. It's serving a function. It's bringing people together, it's giving them good times together, and this perpetuates the smoking because it has these relationship benefits. And so I would argue that, does my next slide argue? Yes, my next slide argues that in joint overweight couples where both people are overweight, in that case, eating and sedentary activity may in fact be fulfilling this kind of symptom system fit. So the kinds of things that are getting them in trouble would be going to the movies and having popcorn and a nice dinner and watching TV together, and that excessive eating and sedentary activity would be linked with these kind of positive relational things, which would make it very hard to stop doing them. Shared overweight status may also help to normalize or excuse it. We're very influenced by the role models around us. And it may also help provide a buffer against stigmatization and so on. So there's a whole bunch of ways that weight status alone, as well as the activities associated with weight gain, eating and lack of or sedentary, could all fit into this kind of positive relational system. In contrast then, the second dynamic that's been studied is what's called a demand withdrawal pattern, and more globally what's been thought of as ironic processes. So an ironic process is when one partner tries to help. They try to fix a problem by doing something, but what it is that they're doing just makes it worse. And demand withdrawal is kind of a classic example of this, where the one partner demands change. I want you to change, I care so much about you, you've got to change it. The other person just feels nagged, undermined, their self-esteem is diminished, which just leads them to drink more. Again, there's a fair bit of evidence in the alcohol literature that this kind of demand withdrawal pattern makes it very, very difficult for an alcoholic to get out of that pattern because they're caught in this sort of ironic process with their partner nagging them, driving them to feel even worse, driving them to drink, which makes their partner nag more, etc. So again, I don't think this has been studied in the context of eating or sedentary activities. And I think that you might expect it in mixed weight couples, where you have one person who is struggling with overweight and the other one who's not, and the other one may very much be trying to help. But if they're in the meantime undermining the heavier person's self-confidence, self-esteem, they may just be perpetuating the problem. The heavier person may be turning to food for emotion regulation, as we've seen, and so this kind of ironic process could play out. So that's what I just said. Okay, and now to come back to a totally different angle here. A second point of the study that we're working on now is to get at this autonomic system stuff. What role does the actual autonomic system play in all this? I don't think I need to tell you folks this, so I'll skip briefly to the literature. As I mentioned, there's two totally different literatures on this topic. The one is largely medical literature done in hospitals, focused on very simple biological, well, not simple biological, but focused totally on the biological process. And this work has found that autonomic function, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, appears to be somewhat rigid and unresponsive in overweight and obese individuals. So I don't want to get into it too much, but the basic idea is it seems that centrally sympathetic activities accelerated, but peripherally the receptors for this are blunted. So you have this kind of overactive sympathetic system that's sort of high and invariant, and it's not fluctuating with environmental input the way you'd expect. And this also seems to be true of the parasympathetic system as indexed by heart rate variability. You see reduced heart rate variability in overweight and obese patients. So in this literature, this has generally been discussed in terms of physiological correlates, so things like insulin resistance and baroreceptor function and so on. But there's an equally large social psychophysiology literature linking exactly these same kind of parameters to emotion regulation difficulties, to depression, to anxiety, to social difficulties. And the argument here is that flexible autonomic function is critical for flexible responding to the environment and flexible emotional and social processing. So we have one literature really looking, saying, hey, this rigidity is going on in obesity and overweight. We're not totally sure why. We have this other literature saying this rigidity is going on with emotional and social difficulties. We're not really sure why. And those two have never, to the best of my knowledge, talked to each other. So I see this part of the study as more of a research question. Is this kind of autonomic rigidity that we see in obese individuals actually related to any kind of emotional self-regulatory issues? And if so, does that actually depend on the kind of weight status and interactional patterns that you're seeing in the couple? So for example, if it's purely a biological thing, you gain weight, it causes sympathetic and parasympathetic rigidity, then all overweight individuals should be showing this more or less, regardless of how they're functioning emotionally and socially and within their close relationships. If, on the other hand, it's tied to these kind of emotional social difficulties, we might see it more in overweight people in mixed weight couples than in joint overweight couples. Don't know. So, yeah, I've got time. So just to summarize then the hypotheses for this study, that we expect that in joint overweight couples, eating and shared weight status are really going to be fulfilling relationship functions. They're going to be helping the relationship function well. And that this is going to be one of the problems in changing. So we would expect unhealthy eating to be associated more with shared positive emotions and increasing couple cohesion and these kind of good couple and emotional stuff. And I'll go out on a limb and make a hypothesis. In this case, they really shouldn't differ from normal weight couples on measures of relationship satisfaction, emotional responding, emotion regulation, or autonomic function. And the last one is really the autonomic function, I think, is a question, not so much a hypothesis. In contrast, mixed weight couples, eating and weight will be sources of discord and it be a focus of a demand-withdraw kind of dynamic. If this is true, then overeating for the overweight partner would be associated more with negative emotions and maybe self-soothing after relationship conflict and so on. And we should have both partners reporting lower relationship satisfaction, quality, higher conflict, and just sort of a more negative relationship in general. And that the overweight partner would differ then from normal weight and joint overweight couples on measures of emotional responding, motion regulation, and autonomic function. So I'll breeze through then how we're trying to get at this. We're doing a lab study. Well, it's a three-pronged study. We're hopefully shooting for 15 couples where both people are overweight or obese, roughly 15 mixed weight, of which half the man would be the overweight and half the woman would be overweight, and about 15 normal weight couples. Defining overweight by BMI, the couples had to be living together and in a committed relationship for at least a year. So here we can get we can start setting higher standards for recruitment for this. And we want both partners to be generally healthy. So we're trying, I think some of our heavier people are going to have things like diabetes and high blood pressure, but only if it's under control and they're functioning well. It's a three-pronged study. We start with a survey that we send to their homes where we ask them everything we could ever think of to ask them. They bring that back with them to the lab, and we do a lab session, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then they send them away with daily diaries that they fill in twice a day for 7 days. And by getting it twice a day, we give more sensitivity to tracking emotional stuff throughout the day and relational stuff. In the interest of time, I won't really, this is the survey, and I've probably forgotten some things. We've asked them everything we could think of. The lab session, I'll say a bit more about. We have this brand new psychophysiology lab, the Lang Laboratory, over in the Norton School. And we're able then to both videotape and collect physiological measures and get self-report measures from 2 people at one time, which is great. So the folks arrive at the lab, we do a full consent at this point. We've done a brief consent through the mailer at home, then we do a full consent at the lab. We get baseline measures and we hook them up for the physiological recording. And we're recording EKG, impedance cardiography, respiration, skin conductance, blood pressure, and have I forgotten anything? So getting a lot of measures of the autonomic system. We do a paced breathing task initially, and if anyone has any interest in RSA, I can tell you about the paced breathing task. It's a form of baseline for the respiration measures and the heart rate variability measures. And then we do a neutral film resting baseline. Then we first of all do a thinking about the relationship task, where we're hoping to get fairly pure autonomic measures where the person is just sitting and thinking. So we asked them to think, first of all, about negative things in their relationship, a recent event where they felt negative about their partner. And we walked them sort of a guided memory task about that. Then we asked them to think about a positive thing in their relationship, something that happened recently where they felt positive about their partner. And we walked them through basically the instructions start, think about what was going on at the time, think what were you thinking, what were you feeling, and walks them through. Then we asked them to have a conversation about lifestyle issues. And here, the physiology gets a little muddier, but we get all the behavioral and expressive component. And we basically asked them to, first of all, talk about how important is a healthy lifestyle to them. And then, what are the things they do that get in the way of each other, living a healthier lifestyle? And what are the things they do that actually help each other? And we're hoping from these videos that we'll be able to code things like, to what extent are they reporting eating in the service of having fun together? To what extent do they get into a demand-withdrawal interaction right there in the lab? And I think we've already seen some of those. Then we actually replay the videotape of their conversation for them to watch, and we give them a rating dial that goes from positive to negative, and get them to tell us how they were feeling during the conversation, using the video just as a cue to help them remember. So what we get from that is a continuous measure of positive-negative experience throughout the whole conversation. So we're able to link up this experiential component with continuous physiology, with continuous behavior from the videotape. So we can ask questions like, at the moment she started nagging him that he should be going to he should be eating less, what did his heart rate do, and what did he behaviorally do in response, and how was she feeling, etc. So it gives us a lot of ability to get into the fine grain. We unhook them. In this study, we're actually able to weigh and measure them and get waist circumference and percent body fat, so we'll have much better actual measures of weight status. And we completely debrief them. And then we send them away for the diaries, where we ask about the obvious things, very similar to the one I told you in the previous study, eating and activity now, their partner's influence attempts, relationship closeness and conflict, emotional experience, emotion regulation. So I think in the last couple, so I'll show you, these are very, very tentative results. This was actually just from some survey data that we did pilot testing the initial measures. So you have to stay tuned for all the fun stuff. But this is just a very small group of 26 people who don't even necessarily go together. But we did find out their own weight status and their partner's weight status. And so one thought that I've been talking about is that eating might provide a shared positive experience for these joint overweight couples. And what we have on the X then, O with O is an overweight person with an overweight partner. O with N is an overweight person with a normal weight partner. NO, normal with overweight, and NN is both normal weight. And the question they're answering here is, how often do you eat with your partner? And we see for the joint overweight couples, they're reporting an average of most of the time, whereas no one else is. So it seems there may be this sort of jointness to eating in general. Who knows? We'll see with the real data set, but I thought that was a good teaser to get going. Similarly, this is a subscale of the emotional eating scale focused on the positive items. So I think the question is something, to what extent do you have the urge to eat when you're feeling the following emotions? This would be calm, satisfied, happy, joyous, loving. And same thing, we see the joint overweight couples, people with a joint overweight couple, reporting a moderate desire to eat in response to positive emotions, and not really anything going on for the other folks. So this again would go with the idea that for them, the overeating is they're getting in trouble through the positive stuff, not the negative. We also were hypothesizing that there's this demand-withdrawal component going on, that the mixed weight couples should show the worst relationship functioning, the least satisfaction, compared to either the joint overweight or the normal. And so same groups on the bottom, and these are two fairly common outcome measures in relationships. Ambivalence is, to what extent are you thinking about leaving? To what extent do you wish you weren't in this relationship? And what we see, and this I think is a sad result, is the normal weight partners, normal weight people with an overweight partner, are up on the very much side of being ambivalent about their relationship. So that's not going to bode well. They're also reporting more conflict. It's interesting in this case the overweight person isn't reporting that conflict. So very small sample, we'll see if we have to interpret that or not. But clearly not as happy in their relationships here. Oh, and then this is to what extent do their conflicts have positive outcomes? So this question asks for things like, do your conflicts get resolved? Do you feel better about each other afterward? Versus this, which says, the conflicts just are terrible. They never get us anywhere. We feel worse than when we started. And both partners in the mixed wave are saying that they really can't resolve these conflicts constructively. So stay tuned from the results for the full sample and all the lab data and all the diary measures. And we're sending Ashley into the lab this weekend to keep getting, we've got 20 couples now, right? So we have full data from 20 couples now, hopefully 45 by the end of the semester. I put my email address up there. I guess it's on your handouts too. So if you have any questions about any of these studies or about the HER group, feel free to email me. And I'll stick around for questions, but I do want to say some thanks. First to our amazing IT guy, Robert Lanza, who made basically the online and the laboratory data collection possible. I already plugged the HER group, who's been a great support for collaboration and sharing ideas. And then the members of my own research group, the Health and Interpersonal Systems group, the HIS group, who've done all the work, and that's folks like Ashley and Shannon. So happy to take questions or stick around if people need to go, feel free. Thank you.